Welcome to the session on the new ISO 9001-2015. What you are going to see in this session is the key differences and impact on the organizations, the changes that have taken place from the earlier version of ISO 9001. We had seen earlier that ISO 9001 was first published by the International Organization for Standardization in 1987, and subsequently this led to the development of many other management system standards. We also saw that at some point of time the users of the standard felt a need for aligning these standards to have a common structure so that it would be easier for organizations to implement these different management system standards. This did happen with the development of Annex SL, which is the high level structure, and it was a requirement for all technical committees of ISO to develop standards based on this common structures, which would facilitate organizations to implement different management system standards. ISO 9001, the 2015 version, is based on this high level structure. There are some significant differences which would push the organizations into developing new strategies for meeting the requirements of these standards. So, we are going to see in the next 25 to 30 minutes what these key changes are and the impact in the organizations. To understand the change, we need to know what the old version, the earlier version of ISO 9001 contained. It had an 8 clause structure starting with the scope, normative references, terms and definitions, quality management systems, management responsibility, resource management, product realization, measurement, analysis and improvement. The new version, the new standard would have 10 clauses, the scope, normative references, terms and definitions, the same as the earlier standard, the context of the organization which is new, a leadership, planning, support, operations, performance evaluations and improvements. While many of these, the requirements of the earlier standards do find a place, we also see that there are some new terms used which includes the context of the organizations, clause 8 which talks about operations, clause 9 which is performance evaluations. These are changes in the structure, changes in the titles of the various clauses. Let us look at some of the significant proposed changes. First, there is an emphasis on leadership. The leadership was a requirement in the earlier versions of the standard too, but there is a new emphasis on leadership. There is a new clause called organizational context, which is expected to lead the organizations into responding to the business environment in which they are placed in. There is a new focus on risk based management. In fact, the clause preventive action does not find a direct place in the new structure, but the risk based management is expected to make sure that the preventive actions are included as a part of management strategy. There is an emphasis on objectives, measurement and change. There is an increased emphasis on achieving value for organizations and its customers. There is a requirement for communication and awareness with added emphasis. There are other changes that have happened when the new standard was developed. There are few prescriptive requirements. The term documented information is used rather than document control or record controls. So, there is a decreased emphasis on documentation in the new version. The outsourcing is now called external provision, which you would see is a change in terminology. There is no requirement for management representative who was expected to report to the management on the implementation of the system. The requirement for reporting is there, but the term management representative does not find a place in the new ISO 9001. Similarly, you would not find a mention of quality manual in the new version, while the documented information covers the requirement for developing any documents that are needed for the system. So, let us look at the key changes with respect to the leadership and the organizational context. Firstly, the organizations will need to determine external and internal issues that are relevant to its purpose. That is, what are the relevant issues both inside and out that have an impact what the organization does or that would affect its ability to achieve the intended outcomes of its management system. The intended outcome which is defined in the scope of the document is providing a product that needs of the customers as well as any applicable regulatory requirements. That is the intended outcome of any management system. It should be noted that the term issue covers not only problems which would have been the subject of preventive actions in previous standards, but also important topics for the management system to address, such as any market assurance and governance goals that the organization might set for its management system. So, this concept needs to be understood. So, this means that the senior managers need to be able to demonstrate an understanding of the wider business environment, social, cultural and regulatory issues, and how that impact or could impact on the organization's ability to meet customer requirements. In the same context, they need to have a grasp of the organization's internal strengths and weaknesses. Obviously, the strengths will have to be leveraged and weaknesses will have to be addressed, and how these could impact the ability to deliver their product or services. This will obviously strengthen the concept of business process management, including the need how to allocate specific responsibilities for processes and demonstrate an understanding of the key risks associated with each process and the approach taken to manage, reduce or transfer the risk. Top management now have a greater involvement in the management system. They have to make sure that the requirements of the management system are integrated into the organization's processes and that the policy and objectives are compatible with the strategic direction of the organization. So, that is the intention. We have another clause which focuses on risk based management. Senior management must be able to demonstrate an understanding of business risks and how they could impact on the ability to meet customer requirements. An effective risk management process will be critical for successful certification of the new version. It must ensure that the management systems can achieve its intended outcome and achieve continual improvement. Clause 6.1 on actions to address risks and opportunities is where this is covered, and it addresses the what, who, how and when of risk management. So, the standard promotes risk based thinking while developing the management system for an organization. The organization should plan actions to address these risks and opportunities, how to integrate and implement the actions into its management system processes and evaluate the effectiveness of these actions. Risk management replaces preventive action. Organizations will need to identify where risk arises and ensure controls are in place to manage it. Remember that risk is defined as the effect of uncertainty on an expected result, and the new standard makes risk based thinking more explicit throughout by making a reference to this at a number of places within the standard. There is a new emphasis, as we saw, on objectives and measurements. The requirements around quality objectives have also been more detailed. They need to be consistent with the quality policy, measurable if practicable of course, monitored and communicated and updated as appropriate. They also have to be established at relevant functions and levels. Objectives should include plans on how to achieve them as well as how the results will be evaluated. So, unless this is done, there is really no point in establishing the objectives. The organization must determine who will be responsible for the delivery of the objectives, resources required, what needs to be done and by when. So, a time limit will have to be set for the achievement of those objectives. So, remember that when establishing quality objectives, organization needs to demonstrate how they plan to achieve them, and remember that the objectives can be technical, strategic or operational. Again, there is a new emphasis on communication and awareness. In fact, there is a separate clause, clause 7.3 on awareness. So, this is a new clause in its own right, and people working within an organization should be aware of the quality policy, objectives, their contribution to QMS, implications of non-conformities, etc. There is an increased emphasis on awareness to ensure that everyone knows the implications of not conforming to the management system requirements. Not that this was not there in the earlier versions of the standard, but certainly there is a new emphasis on this requirement. So, that leads into clause 7.4, which is communication. Internal and external communications are now a requirement. It is up to the organizations to decide what, who, when and how they are communicating. Communication is important for both internal and external stakeholders, and an organization must develop a communication plan. It is important to decide who will own the communication and ensure that they have the appropriate authority, competencies and knowledge. The communication plan can include a variety of mediums including briefings, meetings, seminars, conferences and newsletters. There are fewer prescriptive requirements as seen earlier. There is less emphasis on documentation. So, much will be made of the fact that the new version of the standard has no requirements for procedures, but it does have requirement for documentation. Clause 7.5 on documented information deals with documented information and is split into 3 subclauses: general, creating and updating and control. So, while there is a requirement for documentation, the emphasis is much less than what it used to be in the earlier versions. So, an organization must decide what information they wish to retain, how these are updated and controlled and adequately protected. Clause 8 on operations includes requirements for customer communication from information on products to contracts and invoicing, review of design and development changes, information for external providers, identification and traceability, release of products and services becomes a part of operational controls, non-conforming processes, outputs and products and services. The high level structure has new clause numbers. We have seen there are 10 clauses starting with the scope, the normative references, terms and definition, context of the organization with the subclauses 4.1 to 4.4. Then we have leadership, which has 3 subclauses including management commitment, policy, roles, responsibility and authority. Planning, we saw this clause has a requirement for addressing risks and opportunities. It also has a subclause 6.2 for objectives and plans to achieve them. Clause 7 support has subclauses resources, competence, awareness, communications, documented information. Clause 8 on operations deals with the operation planning and control, which would be the corresponding clause of product realization process in the earlier version. We have performance evaluation, which deals with monitoring, measurement, analysis and evaluation. We have a clause on internal audit and management review, which was present even in the earlier standard. There are no significant changes in these clauses except for the title, which is now performance evaluation. This clause 10 deals with improvement, which has subclauses 10.1 dealing with non-conformity and corrective actions, and subclause 10.2 which deals with continual improvement. So, you would see that the new structure, which has 10 clauses, retains everything that was there in the earlier version of the standard, except that there is less emphasis on documentation, but includes some new requirements like the context of the organization and a risk based thinking that is promoted under clause 6.1. So, let us look at some of the examples, some of the new requirements and try and understand how these could impact an organization. So, clause 4.1, which is understanding the organizations and its context. The organization must determine external and internal issues relevant to its purpose and that affect its ability to achieve the intended outcomes of its QMS. So, what this would mean is for organizations to understand how issues that could be external to the organizations, what kind of stimuli that comes from the external factors. It could be even a change in the rules that are applicable that affect the product, and its internal factors, which mean what its employees want, and these factors often have a bearing on the ability of the organization to sustain itself in the market. 4.2 talks about the understanding and needs and expectations of the interested parties. First, the organization must determine who are the parties that are interested in its own and relevant to its QMS, and what are the needs and expectations of these interested parties. Some of the interested parties which all organizations must consider are its direct customers, who could be wholesalers, the retailers, etc., the end users, the common man who ultimately buys the product for its and uses them, the suppliers, distributors, retailers or others involved in the supply chain, the regulators and any other interested parties. For instance, if it is an EMS, it could be the society around that organization. 4.4, which is the quality management system, this is where the scope of the quality management system needs to be defined. So, the organization must establish, implement, maintain and improve a quality management system, including the processes needed and their interactions in accordance with the requirements of this standard. The concept of process approach and the Plan Do Check Act, that is maintained in the standard, and it will be embedded in all ISO management system standards. So, clause 5.1 on leadership, the top management must demonstrate leadership and commitment with respect to quality management system by, how do they do it? By ensuring the integration of the QMS requirements into the organization's business process. So, this is a significant shift as we have been discussing. Then promoting awareness of the process approach, supporting other relevant management roles to demonstrate the leadership as it applies to the areas of responsibility. Top management must demonstrate leadership and commitment with respect to customer focus. It must be made clear to everyone in the organization that the top management is interested in meeting the customer requirements. So, clause 6.1 we saw was another significant change from the earlier version. This talks about actions to address risks and opportunities. When planning for the QMS, organizations must consider the issues in 4.1, that is the external and internal issues, and the requirements in 4.2, which is the needs and expectations of its interested parties, and then determine the risks and opportunities that need to be addressed. First, why we need to do this? First, to assure the QMS can achieve its intended outcomes, prevent or reduce undesired effects and achieve improvement. The organization must plan actions to address the risks and opportunities and how to integrate and implement actions into its QMS processes and evaluate the effectiveness of these actions. It is not enough if you carry out the processes, but you also need to evaluate whether these are effective or not. Clause 7.1 is on resources. The organization must determine and provide the resources needed for the QMS, that is for the establishment, implementation, maintenance and improvement of the QMS. The resources may include infrastructure, it certainly would include the process environment, it includes the monitoring, whatever resources are required for monitoring, which could be equipments, test equipments, the calibration facilities and so on, and knowledge. You would notice that this is again a new requirement. Every organization would need knowledge for its processes and operations. So, there is a special emphasis based on this particular subclause which talks about knowledge management. Clause 8.1 is a familiar one. This is the operational planning and control. The organization must plan, implement and control the processes needed to meet requirements and to implement the actions determined in clause 6.1. Remember the clause that deals with identifying risks, threats and opportunities, and deciding on actions to mitigate them. So, you do this planning and control by establishing criteria for the processes, implementing the controls of the processes in accordance with the criteria, keeping sufficient documented information to demonstrate the processes have been carried out as planned. The earlier version of the standard, you would find this as records, record management or record control. The organization must control, plan and review the consequences of unintended changes, taking action to mitigate the adverse effects as necessary. So, some of the changes actions that are planned usually go on, but many occasions you would find that there are unintended changes that take place in any system. So, the organization must be alert to this and take actions to mitigate any adverse effects of these unintended changes. No? The organization must ensure the operation of a function or a process of the organization by an external provider is controlled. Again, in the earlier version, the term that was used was outsourcing. So, now we make a reference to the external provider, which could also include the supplier to the organization. The organizations from where purchases are made, he is also an external provider. No? Control of external provision of goods and services is covered in 8.4. The organization must ensure that externally provided goods and services satisfy the specified requirements. So, there is a note which clarifies that this includes outsourcing. Clause number 9 deals with monitoring, measurement and evaluation. This is the clause that provides inputs for improvement. So, when you monitor the processes and products at different stages, it could be at the incoming stage, it could be at the process stage, or it could be at the final stage before the product is shipped out. You have a lot of data that could be used for analysis. When you evaluate suppliers and decide on from whom you would buy, again there is a lot of data that is generated. So, all this data is meant to be analyzed periodically and provides an input for the subsequent clause number 10, which is on improvements. Similarly, internal audit is again another tool for ensuring that your systems are effective and provides the management with the tool for identifying weak areas which could be strengthened by proper implementation of the corrective actions. So, a management review again is a familiar clause which was there in the earlier version too, and is expected to ensure that the performance of the systems are reviewed at least on an annual basis, and the outcomes of the management review should give a direction for the organization to improve. So, you would find clause number 10 talks about the improvements, and this clause provides the inputs for making the improvements to the system. So, you would find that the 10 clauses put together provide covers all the requirements of the earlier versions. So, has some additional requirements with the emphasis on how the organization can sustain itself in the marketplace, and truly the new standard would push the organizations to a different level. So, you can say that the bar has been raised, and now it is for the organizations to effectively implement the standards so that they could sustain themselves in the marketplace. So, thank you.